Hello, I'm Mike Bell, and I'm the secretary of this all-party group on issues affecting men and boys. And the aim of this group is to develop the links between parliamentarians and those who are active on men's issues in the UK. This is one of a series of interviews with APPG members. You can find out more about APPGs and our work by following the links below this video. And you can support our work by subscribing to this channel, following us on Twitter, inviting others to do the same, or even making a financial contribution to support our work via the website. Well, good morning, Michael Farmer, and thank you very much for joining us on this interview for the APPG on issues affecting men and boys. Can you just give us a bit of background, how you ended up in the House of Lords and becoming a member of the APPG?
Well, morning, Mike. I think I started being interested in politics maybe 20 odd years ago. And particularly, I was concerned about really focusing in, I suppose, the breakdown of family life in this country. And that I became more and more aware of the detail of that. And I started supporting the Centre for Social Justice. And they produced a report called Breakdown Britain, which showed that we were, I think, fifth from the bottom of the OECD, about 32 countries in family breakdown. And the repercussions of family breakdown in our society are actually immense and widespread and really unseen or unknown in a way. Particularly at that time, I think the report Breakdown Britain was an eye-opener for many, and particularly for me. So I considered actually in those days that the Conservative Party was the party of the family. We were we seemed to be in a culture of sort of individual liberalism, where you do what you want to do, but try not to hurt other people. But that doesn't really. It's not a culture of recognizing the value of family and good relationships. So I started supporting Conservative Party. In the end, they asked me to be treasurer, so I was treasurer of the party from 11 to 15 under Cameron. I didn't know whether I was coming into the Lords or not. I mean, I never really thought about it. But actually, when it was sort of hinted at, mentioned, and when I was asked if I wanted to be, I thought, well, that's very nice, and I'm sure my wife will be very happy. And then a few hours later, I thought, well, I can speak. I can actually stand up and speak about these issues. And so I came into the House in 2014, and that's been the sort of motivation.
Okay, that's interesting. So your primary motivation is the breakdown of the family.
Yeah.
One of the things that in men's issues people find is that a lot of the narrative is about deadbeat dads or how men are not paying. But our common experience is that men are spending thousands of pounds and getting near a nervous breakdown simply trying to keep contact with their children.
Yes. Well, a family, should be a father and mother and children. And I feel that we've been living in a society for the last 50 years or so, where you've had a culture really which thinks that men control women, and actually it's a patriarchal society, and that women are the ones who are vulnerable, ill-treated, and attention must be given to them. So that's very much the narrative that's developed. And the attention has been given to women, whether it's in domestic violence or whether it's in prison reform, or even in education, even in health. You have a women's health strategy, women and girls health strategy. You don't have a men and boys health strategy. And so there is this culture of seeing men as controlling, as the patriarchs, and a lot of the wrong things in society coming from them. So there hasn't been the attention given to them that there has been to women. And I think father absence, and the almost iconic picture, which I think developed in policy in the 90s and noughties, of the single mum as a political something to be supported, and that there really wasn't any question of, well, where was dad and why wasn't dad there, and was there anything we could do? That did dad need help as well?
This is interesting that quite often on the news, when they're talking about poverty, they interview a single mum, but the interviewers never ask that question.
No, there you have the example. It's always the same. So you have a public which understands that women are in a way hard done by men, where of course the story is very much more nuanced and balanced. I mean, I'm not saying that women aren't, and I'm a great supporter of women, and but there has been an imbalance.
Yes, you made a speech, I think, just last week on was it International Women's Day, in which you were extolling the virtues of women and what they particularly bring to society. Yeah. And I was wondering whether you think society is making a mistake in thinking that men and women are more similar than they actually are, and that what we should be doing is celebrating the different and complementary things which the sexes bring.
Well, that's exactly what I think. And I think, I mean, for many times before I've sort of dug deeper and got more data and research into the whole thing. But I worked in the city for 50 years, and quite frankly, life has been a struggle, full of sometimes extremely deep stress. And the whole area of a man seeing his role as providing the home, providing the food, etc., that particular role, I ask myself, why do women want to be like a man? Frankly, we die earlier, more of us are in prison, more of us are lying in the streets, we kill ourselves more than they do. In life is stressful, struggle. Frankly, why do they want to be when they have so many wonderful attributes, which I listed out last week? There's just, I mean, they're more sensitive in many ways. I mean, they're more sensitive to touch, more sensitive to smell. The whole relational orientation of women is far more marked than in men. That they're much more aware of people around them and have empathy for them than men, who are sort of focused on the job in hand. And these are things to be valued and encouraged. And why eradicate them and try and make them like us? I mean, it's a serious question which needs some thought.
It is interesting that when people talk about women's equality, they tend to only talk about MPs and CEOs, and they don't talk about dustmen or lorry drivers or deep sea fishermen. And it is a curious thing that as men we are prepared to go and do those things, or as you say, dedicate our entire life to the job in the city, to the exclusion of all else. and that isn't net. I mean, these are great things to do, but they're quite tough.
They are, and I mean, I'm actually a Christian, but I used to give talks in the city because the city was a great place for men bowing down to the idols in the city, which was either the corporate god or money or just that competitive spirit of climbing up the ladder. And you leave home early in the morning, get home late at night. And I used to say, in the Old Testament, you had incidents of Israel sacrificing their children on the altars of Moloch. And we think to ourselves, how absolutely awful, how dreadful. And yet men today can so easily, sacrifice their wives and children on the altar of the company god, on that whole sort of climbing the greasy pole. And then when you come to retirement, you're burnt out and you shuffle off this mortal coil.
Yes, it's very. So one of the things you did was you founded the Family Hubs network. Was that all part of your concern about the family?
Absolutely. Well, I have to give due credit to Dr. Samantha Callan, who was one of the authors of Breakdown Britain for CSJ, and she and I supported CSJ, and she became my parliamentary advisor, actually, because when I came into the Lords, I needed help. I mean, it's the processes, the protocols, I mean, you name it. I mean, it's a very intimidating place if you're by yourself and you're ignorant. And she had a great deal of wisdom about how Westminster works, but she also had this very deep knowledge of family, and actually had been in Cameron shadow policy unit in charge of families, actually in 2009, around that time. So in a way, we founded it together. It had been an idea, but the whole, in a way, you could say it's sort of building on Labour's Sure Start centres, of which, in my opinion, there were too many and it cost too much money. Family hubs are actually something which has grown from the bottom up, and it's only recently that government sort of woken up and saying, this is happening, perhaps we should join ourselves to it. But you're finding places like Doncaster or Chelmsford or Isle of Wight or even Westminster, they're starting their own family hubs, which is a hub, a location, and it can be virtual, but it's much better to be physical. And it can actually be mobile for rural areas sometimes as well, where local councils, local authorities produce a bespoke sort of hub where departments of government, local charities, the local council authority, they all work together to provide services for families. And I sort of give the example of a single mum, again, say of a 13-year-old lad, and he comes home and she finds he's got some white powder in his pocket. Well, what does she do? She doesn't want to go to the police, and she doesn't want to go to social services. But you could go to a hub which is non-stigmatizing and actually have there some considered help in the direction that she should go for help to deal with that problem at that time. Mm. So it's there as a service actually to try and strengthen family relationships, keep families together, give them help. We had the troubled families, we still do, I think it's called something else now, where a social worker would go into a very chaotic household and just this one worker would sort out the chaos. But the next step from that is that you can now go to one place where, you may not be quite so chaotic as a troubled family, but you can actually go to one place where they can help you sort out, the problems at home and help families stick together, really. So yes. You've got MOJ talking about having some of their reconciliation services working through family hubs.
So the family hubs are run by the local authority, or are they volunteers?
Yeah. No, no, no. Now, I mean, the government's behind it and allocating money to it. So it is the ownership is local authority, but you're wanting every department of government, including health. I mean, at the moment, health, MOJ, DWP, DEFRA, all these departments should be having available within the hub access to it, if you like.
Okay. Can we get back to this sort of bias, sort of an over bias in favor of women and the kind of neglect of men? Because I noticed that you remember the Joint Select Committee on the Domestic Abuse Bill back in 2019. It was something that a team I'm part of were keeping up with. And what we noticed was that both on that select committee and in the scrutiny committee in the Commons later in the year, the only oral evidence was given on behalf of female victims.
Yes.
And there's a new inquiry, a Lord's inquiry into the workings of the Children's Act, which is just in process at the moment. And already they've had oral evidence, but again, it's, as far as we can tell, is almost all from the perspective of women.
Yeah.
And can you help us understand how it can be that parliamentary committees just simply don't hear from men?
Well, I think it comes back to what I said before, the sort of perspective, the overarching perspective is that, you know, we are in a patriarchy, and actually the faults lie with men, and it's women who are abused and who need help. I mean, in that particular domestic violence committee, I was a relative new boy, but I kept pressing for evidence from men, because there is no doubt that well-researched data shows that 30% of domestic abuse is women on men, and 50% of domestic abuse is mutual.
Yeah.
So they're fighting each other. So you're absolutely right, and I was very frustrated and annoyed, and drowned out, if you like. I mean, not so much drowned out, but just sort of sidelined,
ignored it. Yes.
That when I mentioned these things, everyone would listen politely, and then even when I talked to the chair, etc., and nothing was done. I mean, it you know, one sort of gets paranoid. You sort of feel everybody's against you, including the clerks and everybody. And particularly, it depends who the expert advisor is as well. If, you know, these committees bring on board expert advisors, and, you know, that's quite important. If you bring one on who's an out and out feminist, then you'll have this narrative, and that will be the only one that's attended to. And I'm afraid to say, I mean, I'm aware of this the committee on the 2014 Children's Act. It's only just started. I wasn't aware that the same old thing was happening. But that's why it's so important that we have a Men and Boys APPG, because actually there has been silence on that side, and Parliament and parliamentarians need to raise the issue. I mean, and it's a very serious issue. I mean, I was saying earlier on, why do women want to be like men? And you know, just looking at this morning, I mean, there was an article in the Times last week, I think, just a small little one. The statistics for 2018, it were suicides in the age group 15 to 24. It wasn't just in 2018. I think it was over 4 years. there were 182 female suicides over a period of 4 years. There were 532 male. And that's in the age group 15 to 24. And as you go up the age range, the gap gets bigger.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's just one example. Another example is prisons. Well, that was one area where I was going to every department of government when I became a peer and saying, what are you doing about family breakdown, et cetera, et cetera. You know, because every department of government it affects. I mean, family breakdown just it affects productivity, the economy, but you know, it affects the MOJ, prisons, all right. And it was interesting that they asked me to do a review because they had a statistic that their own statistic that prisoners who received family visits were 39% less likely to reoffend than those who didn't. And they said, well, perhaps you could do a review on how to strengthen prisoners' family relationships in order to reduce recidivism and the intergenerational transmission of crime, which, believe it or not, if you were a child of a prisoner, male or female, you had a 60% chance of being in prison yourself when you grew up. So I did these. I did a review for the male estate in 2017 and a review for the female estate in 2019. And actually, the MOJ, to give them their due, they're the first department that really cottoned on to this. And they've accepted all my recommendations in both reviews. And I went to see the Five Wells new prison the week before last, just being opened. And a lot of those recommendations are being implemented. We have an implementation committee just to see how they're going along. And it's so much more aware of relationships and you know, the positive outcomes of a good relationship. And they can see that. I mean, the other departments of government, you know, one's still having a battle. But again, the fundamental statistic, we have roughly nearly 80,000 men in prison. How many women? 4,000. And yet you listen to the voices, and the loudest voices are, we shouldn't have any women in prison. Well,
it's very curious, isn't it? Because when you have a woman who commits an offence,
yeah,
the first thing that people look for is the social background. You know, was she abused, or what happened in her childhood?
Yeah.
But when a man does the same offence, it's so he must be a bad man and needs to be locked up.
Yeah.
And yet we had that evidence from Naomi Murphy, who works in prisons. And other research shows that a huge percentage of these, you know, bad men are in fact abused children.
Absolutely. Well, 25% of the prison population have been in care. I mean, there you have the evidence.
Yeah.
I mean, but also, you know, there's a whole wing, big wing in Park Prison in Bridgend in Wales. What's it full of? Military. You know, I mean, there are reasons why men are in prison, but there's very little attention given to it.
Yeah.
And this whole, I think my reviews have really started to change the culture and see there is a background, these ACEs, you know, adverse childhood experiences, which are more on the radar screen. And that actually we should be paying attention to the men as we do to the women. I'm not saying don't attend to the women, but I mean, there are some evil women who do some bad things who should be in prison. You can't have everyone out. And there are some evil men, and you know, that should be there, of course. But there isn't the attention given to men to understand why the prisons are so full of men, and can we do something about it? What's the background? You know, to approach it in the same positive, constructive angle as we do to women.
Yes, interestingly, the we polled the members of the APPG about the next topic, and the next topic people want to do is suicide, male suicide.
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll be able to tap in on your knowledge on that one.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's very sad. You see, men again. One of the reasons why there isn't the attention given to men is, I think, because men don't speak up. You know, if a man is contemplating suicide, I think sometimes the last thing he'll do is talk to anybody about it, whereas a woman will talk. But a man will probably think, well, if I talk to somebody about it, they'll stop me doing it, and they're far more, if you like, constructive about how to do it.
It is interesting, though. We had that contribution from Andy's Man Club in January, and they seem to have cracked something about male mental health, but they have created environments which men do talk. But what it isn't one man going to one counsellor and sitting in a chair. And there was also that interesting contribution from Natasha Devon, in which she said that if you want boys in school to talk about their problems, it's important that you combine the role of the careers counsellor with the counsellor, so that the boy can actually say he's going to the counsellor, and it could well be about careers.
Right.
And then he'll talk, but he won't even make the appointment if he thinks that people will rib him for going to see the counsellor.
Yes, I mean the men's sheds one was the same sort of thing.
Yes.
I mean, so I find it very interesting if you go to a big sporting event, no football match, or I mean, you know, go to a cricket match at Lord's. It's by and large full of men, all right, and they're all there, and you're sitting there all day long, and there's this buzz the whole day long. Everything is buzzing, you know, and all their faces are looking forward and they're looking at the next ball, but they're actually talking this way. They're talking, and they're talking all day long, and it's you know, this is in a way how men socialize and relax and talk to each other and enjoy each other, but they're focusing on, you know, the next ball, and it's I mean, it's a whole area of study and you know, constructive and helpful thought that needs to be done, I think, here.
Yes, I think it was one of the strongest things that came through in our last report, the case for a men's health strategy, that actually it's all about providing services in the ways which men access them, rather than simply providing services and blaming men for not accessing them. Yeah. And I was particularly interested in this case from Ireland, where part of the men's health strategy, they actually took the heart disease testing out to farmers' markets, because then the farmers did take up the screening, whereas they didn't leave their farm and drive to town to do it.
Yeah, that's right.
So do you think there's anything can be done? As you mentioned, that, you know, there's in the domestic abuse bill, there was all this focus on women. There was a violence against women and girls strategy, of course, a really good thing to have, but none for men. The women's health strategy, we've got 1.5 ministers for women, but none for men. It does seem incredibly unfair. Yeah.
Well, there is an imbalance, and I think it comes back to what we were saying before, is because you have this pendulum swinging, I find, the whole time in a certain direction, and we are as a society, we tend to all swing together with only a few people, you know, lagging behind, if you like. But I think that there's been this belief, there's this acceptance of this sort of background story of patriarchy and men CEOs and men on boards and you know, men dominating and controlling, which has silenced any thought almost, let alone discussion about actually what's the reality of a man's life or of men's lives, and should we be looking at in deeper knowledge, the data of the like prisons, like homelessness, like suicides, like his educational achievements, all these things. And I think this is where the APPG, I think, can be important. It's really relatively new, but we need to start getting this onto the radar screen, whether in parliamentary questions, whether in articles in newspapers or in the media. But we're the ones actually at the moment seeming to dig down and get the evidence, and we need to make it known.
Do you think there's any possibility? I mean, basically, the APPG is just run by a couple of volunteers. Do you think there's any possibility of scaling up?
I think there has to be. I think we need to. I think we need to work to scale it up. I think it really is very, very important, actually.
What we notice is, we're kind of ticking off, like, we're going to do something on suicide, but when are we going to do something about boys' education? Or when are we going to do something about prisons? It's like this huge list of huge topics.
Yeah.
And I agree that men are, largely to blame, because if you just take that domestic abuse bill, there was hardly any even written contributions from men. We're just not geared up to act on our own behalf.
Yeah, I think there's two things there. We're not geared up to speak about it because it's almost unmanly.
Yeah.
And the other side, so to speak, is geared up all to speak about females. So it's it's a perfect storm, if you like, which sort of just silences out any discussion on the need to help men and boys.
Yeah. In your time in the Lords, have you noticed any change in that culture? Do you think things are getting worse or getting better?
I think they're much the same. I mean, the International Women's Debate that I contributed to last week, there was an awful lot about, the persecution women suffer, the abuse that women suffer, etc., etc. I mean, my speech particularly, I wanted to raise up, the wonderful qualities of women and how we should applaud them. If I hadn't been there, I think to a certain extent it would have been the same old narrative. Yeah.
Right.
And so we do have to fight it. And I think there will be. I'm hoping, and I do think there is a gradual awakening, an opening of eyes, that actually it's not all well on the male side of the population.
It is interesting. I know that some people men fear that if they raise these issues, they'll be ridiculed or whatever. But interestingly, our chair, Nick Fletcher, has taken quite a upfront attitude, and it just requires people to speak up.
Yeah.
And other people will go, well, maybe I can speak up too.
Yeah, I think that's quite right, Mike. Actually, I think if we make people aware, I think there's a large section of good people who will think, oh, yeah, actually, we haven't been paying attention, and look at these statistics, and we need to do something. So, I mean, from that point of view, I think, Nick's doing a great job, and bully for him. He's a wonderful red wall MP, and he's just got that wonderful northern accent. That's why I think the APPG is actually quite important.
Okay. My final question, because we have run quite long, is what do you think about the culture into which boys and young men are growing up? Do you think that they're growing up in a healthy culture?
No, not particularly. I mean, I think boys sort of ask themselves, what am I here for? A lot of attention is paid to girls. It seems that boys and men sort of get it in the neck a bit. So there is almost an existential question, which I think must be forming in the background of their minds as they go through the teenage years. What am I here for? So at the moment, I think we're in a bad place, and we do need action, and we need awareness and education, and government, I think, certainly needs to be educated, and they need to start paying attention to it, like having a health strategy, but also, just being aware of the outcomes of young lads as they grow up, because it's not good.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's been a very helpful interview. And let's hope we can make some progress.
Yes, well, thank you for all the good work you're doing. You're an engine of enthusiasm, and you're like the bishop on the Bayeux tapestry, which says in French, the bishop encourages his troops, and he's sitting on his horse with his spear, prodding the back of his troops in front. Anyway, thanks very much, Mike.